Welcome to episode 23 of Islam in the Contemporary World, a new narrative. Can a return to independent reasoning Ijtihad revive Islam's relevance in the modern age? Today, we uncover Zafarullah Khan's call for intellectual renewal to meet the challenges of our time through courageous reinterpretation rooted in Islamic principles. So we're diving into Zafarullah Khan's perspective today, and it sounds, well, pretty potent. It's from his work, Islam in the Contemporary World, a new narrative. He starts with this quite stark observation, doesn't he? That Islam, meant as a mercy, is often linked now with things like exploitation, poverty, even terror in some contexts.
Yeah, it's a strong opening. He sees many Muslim communities as sort of stuck, disconnected from the present day, struggling to figure out how to live Islamically now in the modern world.
And he thinks this stagnation is actually holding people back, preventing peaceful, prosperous lives.
Exactly, holding them back from reaching their potential. And his call is pretty direct. Muslims need to, quote, arise out of deep slumber and reform themselves.
Wow. And he pins this whole problem, this inability to adapt, on one main thing.
He does. He links it directly to a lack of something he calls real Ijtihad.
Ijtihad, okay, that seems to be the key term here.
It's absolutely central, the engine for the change Khan wants to see. So in this deep dive, we really need to unpack what Ijtihad means, according to Khan, and the sources he uses, like Iqbal, why it's so crucial.
And where specifically he thinks it's needed most urgently today, right? Those complex areas.
Precisely, where the hard thinking needs to happen.
Okay, let's start right there. What is Ijtihad? Where does the word come from? What's the core idea?
Well, the word itself, Ijtihad, it comes from the Arabic root juhud.
Juhud.
Yeah, which means to exert effort. So fundamentally, it's about striving, putting in serious work.
Okay, exertion.
Yeah.
And in the Islamic legal context.
In that context, it means specifically to exert with a view to form an independent judgment on a legal question. It's the intellectual heavy lifting, you know.
Yeah, independent judgment. Got it. And this isn't some brand new idea, is it? The source traces it back quite early.
Oh, definitely not new. There are hints in the Quran, like the verse about God showing the path to those who exert, but it gets much clearer with a specific hadith.
The story about Mu'adh going to Yemen.
That's the one. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, sends Mu'adh as a judge and asks him how he'll decide cases.
And Mu'adh lays out his process.
Exactly. He says, first the Quran. If the answer's not there, then the Sunnah of the Prophet's practice.
Right.
And if it's still not clear, he says, I will make Ijtihad through my judgment. I'll use my own reasoning based on the sources. And the Prophet approved it.
So that established a kind of hierarchy, Quran, Sunnah, then this independent reasoning.
Yes, it provides a foundation for using reasoned judgment when direct textual answers aren't available.
Now, how does someone like Iqbal, a more modern thinker, Khan references, frame this concept? You mentioned him talking about a principle of movement.
Right. Iqbal's perspective is really interesting. He says, look, Islam has these eternal, unchanging core principles, the muqamat.
Things like the oneness of God, prophethood.
Exactly. Tawheed, prophethood, the hereafter, human dignity. These are the anchors, the permanent truths.
Okay.
But life itself, the world around us, is constantly changing. The Quran itself points to change as a sign of God. So Iqbal sees Ijtihad as the crucial link. It's the principle of movement that lets Islam engage with change while holding on to those permanent principles.
So it's not about changing the religion itself.
Not at all. It's about interpreting and applying those core truths to the specific circumstances of every age, including ours.
Which makes it sound less like an option and more like a necessity.
Absolutely.
Although,
Khan argues it's not just a religious duty, but a human necessity and a demand of the time. You need it to keep up. Think about science, society, economics. They're always evolving. Ijtihad is how Islamic principles stay relevant and applicable.
can you give an example? You mentioned trade earlier.
Yeah, trade is a good one. The basic Islamic principles for trade, honesty, fairness, no exploitation, those are timeless.
Right.
They applied when people were trading with camels and boats.
Oh.
But today, we have global shipping, airplanes, the internet, complex finance, e-commerce.
Totally different ballgame.
Completely. So Ijtihad is needed to figure out how do those principles of honesty and fairness apply to, say, online contracts or international banking rules or digital currency. The principles are the same, but the application needs fresh thinking.
And this need, it doesn't just stop at some point. I think the source mentioned al-Shatibi.
That's right. The classical scholar al-Shatibi made the point that the need for Ijtihad continues until the day of judgment. because Sharia gives us broad principles, foundational guidelines.
Yeah, but life keeps throwing up new situations.
Exactly. New issues, new technologies, new social structures constantly emerge. You always need interpretation and application. You always need Ijtihad to address them based on Islamic guidance.
Okay, so it's this essential tool for navigating change. The source also mentions different sort of levels or degrees of Ijtihad from the classical schools.
Yeah, the old law schools had distinctions like complete authority for the founders, relative authority for scholars within a school, special authority for specific, tricky cases.
Sounds a bit complex.
It can be, but Khan helpfully simplifies it into two main types for his argument: partial Ijtihad and total Ijtihad.
Okay, partial sounds like smaller scale.
Pretty much. Applying the principles to more specific, contained situations. The example given is from after the Battle of the Ditch.
Ah, the prayer timing debate.
Exactly. The Prophet, peace be upon him, told some companions not to pray the Asr prayer until they reached a certain location, Banu Qurayza. But sunset was approaching before they got there.
So they had a dilemma.
Right. One group took the command, absolutely, literally, don't pray until you arrive, and delayed the prayer, even though the time passed. Another group interpreted the instruction differently. They thought the emphasis was on getting there quickly, so they prayed Asr on time along the way.
And what happened?
The key thing is, when the Prophet heard about both approaches, he approved both interpretations.
So different conclusions, both considered valid acts of Ijtihad.
Precisely. That's partial Ijtihad in action, applying principles to a specific command with sincere effort leading to different yet acceptable understandings.
Okay, that makes sense. What about total Ijtihad then? That sounds bigger, more significant.
It is. Total Ijtihad is described as something more profound, rising above the immediate popular thinking, maybe even the apparent literal meaning sometimes, to reach a judgment that serves the greater long-term interest and spirit of the Sharia.
Like looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly. The source gives two really powerful examples from early Islamic history. The first one is the Treaty of Hudaybiyah.
Right, that treaty caused a lot of anger among the companions at the time, didn't it?
It really did. On the surface, the terms seemed like a defeat. They couldn't perform their pilgrimage that year. The Prophet's title, Prophet of Allah, was removed from the document at the insistence of the Quraysh. People like Umar were openly questioning it. It felt humiliating.
But the Prophet accepted it.
He did, because he, through this act of total Ijtihad, saw beyond the immediate concessions. He understood the long-term strategic gain. The peace treaty would stop the fighting, open up communication, allow people to interact, and ultimately lead to Islam spreading peacefully.
And later the Quran itself called it a manifest victory.
It did. Surah 48, verse 1. That's total Ijtihad. Making a difficult, potentially unpopular decision based on deep insight into the principles and a far-sighted vision for the future good, even if it goes against the grain at the time.
Wow. What's the second example? Sohaib Rumi.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sohaib Rumi's story. During his emigration to Medina, he was stopped by robbers who demanded all his wealth, threatening to kill him.
Okay.
Now, dying while defending your property can be considered a form of martyrdom in Islam, which is obviously highly praised.
So he could have fought back.
He could have, but he made a different choice. He performed an act of ijtihad. He gave up his wealth to save his life.
Why is that seen as total Ijtihad?
Because he weighed the options. He chose preserving his life, allowing him to reach Medina and contribute to building the new Muslim community and furthering the cause of Islam over the personal spiritual reward of martyrdom in that specific context, defending material possessions. He prioritized the larger ongoing contribution over immediate personal sacrifice. It required judgment and courage.
These examples really show it involves significant foresight and maybe even going against initial reactions.
Definitely. And it underlines that Ijtihad isn't just some academic exercise. It's presented as vital, beneficial, even obligatory.
Obligatory. And an act of worship, too.
Yes, the source emphasizes that. It's seen as leading to spiritual reward. And this is backed up strongly by another key hadith, the hadith of the judge.
Ah, yes, you mentioned this one. The one about rewards even for mistakes.
That's the one, narrated by Amr ibn al-As. It says, when a judge exerts themselves, makes ijtihad to reach a ruling, if they get it right, they get a double reward. But, and this is crucial, if they try their absolute best, make a sincere effort, but end up being wrong, they still get a single reward.
Just for the effort. That's huge.
It really is. It basically removes the paralysis of fearing error. As long as the effort is genuine and based on the right principles, the striving itself is rewarded.
So the takeaway from that hadith is keep doing Ijtihad.
Absolutely. The source argues this settles it. Ijtihad must continue. Mistakes might happen, but the process itself, the exertion, is valued and rewarded. One reward for trying, a second if you happen to be right.
Which brings us right back to Khan's critique of the present. He's saying Muslims have stopped, right?
Right.
And specifically because they're afraid of being wrong.
Exactly. He argues this fear of error, this reluctance to engage in ijtihad, is directly contrary to the spirit of that hadith and is a major reason for the stagnation and, as he puts it, the disgrace facing many Muslim communities today.
So if it's so necessary, so encouraged, even rewarded, why did it stop? Why the stagnation? What does Khan identify as the main obstacles?
Well, first off, he dismisses the whole notion that the door of ijtihad is closed. He calls it, along with Iqbal and others like Sarkashi, a pure fiction.
Strong words.
Very. He suggests this idea gained traction, partly because legal thought eventually crystallized into the established schools of law, making things seem settled. And partly he suggests it came from a period of, well, intellectual laziness and spiritual decline.
Intellectual laziness. He doesn't pull punches.
No, he doesn't. He links it to a tendency to almost idolize the great thinkers of the past, creating personality cults around them.
Meaning people become afraid to question or deviate from earlier opinions.
Exactly. Afraid to even critically analyze the rulings of respected historical jurists. And he points to a kind of taboo around intellectual or academic criticism within many Muslim communities today.
Which he contrasts with how things used to be.
Sharply. He brings up Imam Abu Hanifa's own students, Imam Muhammad and Imam Abu Yusuf. They disagreed with their teacher on a huge number of issues. The source says something like 85%.
85%. Wow. But they were still respectful.
Completely. Respect remained, but intellectual independence thrived. Think about the companions differing with the Prophet himself, like at Hudaybiyah. Disagreements were normal during the time of the rightly guided caliphs. Difference wasn't seen as disrespect back then.
But today, often, any difference of opinion can be taken as an attack.
Precisely. And Khan contrasts this with, say, modern legal education in the West. Like in the UK, critiquing high court judgments is standard practice. It's how you learn critical thinking, how legal understanding evolves.
So the lack of that critical culture holds things back.
It leads to stagnation. It seems a key part of Khan's argument is this uncritical reverence for the past, almost freezing thought, preventing engagement with present realities.
He even critiques someone like Shah Waliullah on this point, despite his huge contributions.
Yeah, he acknowledges Shah Waliullah's immense work, but points out that even he didn't fully grasp the massive shifts happening in his time. The Western Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution starting up, the rise of European power, the importance of the new sciences and social sciences.
And Khan also sees misplaced priorities in more recent times.
Yes, he argues there's been an overemphasis, in some circles, on physical conflict, on jihad or qitl, over the intellectual struggle, the dawah, the call to Islam.
His point being that the jihadi movements haven't really succeeded in making Islam dominant.
Despite immense sacrifices, yes. He suggests the focus should perhaps be more on the pen than the sword, going back to the very first Quranic command, Iqra. The intellectual effort is fundamental.
And he's critical of leadership, too, for not fostering this intellectual climate.
Very critical. He suggests leadership has often fallen to elites who lack genuine intellect, knowledge, faith, or morals, and are more driven by power or money. He even calls out some Islamists for backing corrupt regimes, thinking they'd somehow implement Islam.
So this lack of ijtihad, this intellectual sterility, he calls it, has had real-world consequences.
He links it directly to the decline of past Muslim empires, the current inertia, ignorance, the dangers faced, the general deterioration, and even a sense of exhaustion and depression in parts of the Muslim world.
He makes that striking point about scientists, too.
Yeah, that the Muslim world hasn't produced globally recognized scientific geniuses for maybe 500 years, contrasting it with a long list from Europe during the same period: Newton, Einstein, Galileo, Darwin, and so on. It's a stark indicator for him of this intellectual shutdown. He even mentions the destruction of historical Islamic sites by some groups as another symptom.
Okay, so the diagnosis is pretty clear. Ijtihad is vital, it's rewarded, but it has stalled due to fear, laziness, and misplaced priorities, leading to stagnation. Where then does Khan say this total ijtihad is most urgently needed right now? What are the big issues?
He lays out several absolutely critical areas where he believes the classical fiqh, the legal framework, just doesn't map onto today's realities anymore. The context is too different.
Where does he start? Muslim minorities.
That's a huge one. Think about it. Classical Islamic law mostly developed when Muslims were the ruling majority. It didn't really need to spell out in detail how Muslims should live as minorities under non-Muslim governments.
So there's a gap in guidance.
A big one. Khan argues this leftover majority mentality causes real problems today, especially for Muslims living in the West. He mentions examples of what he calls blustering, like people making provocative statements about taking over, which just creates unnecessary friction and isn't actually part of Islamic teaching for minorities.
So the Ijtihad needed is how to be a faithful and constructive minority.
Exactly. What does Islamic guidance actually say about living under non-Muslim law? Is obeying local laws binding? These questions need serious, reasoned answers based on principles, not just assumptions carried over from a different era.
And the flip side of that coin, the rights of minorities living in Muslim-majority countries.
Another critical area needing total ijtihad, he argues. Concepts from classical fiqh, like the zimmi status for protected non-Muslims, the jizya tax, sometimes rules about dress codes, these were developed centuries ago.
In a very different world.
Totally. Khan says these need urgent rethinking in light of modern ideas about universal human rights, citizenship, and constitutional guarantees, especially post-World War I. He's very clear. Maltreating minorities badly damages Islam's image, which fundamentally preaches justice for all. Ijtihad is needed to align the timeless principle of justice with modern realities.
Okay, what about women's rights? That's often a major point of discussion.
Yes, and Khan tackles it head-on. He points out that many laws and opinions regarding women, things like the rules around second marriage for men, certain aspects of testimony in court, specific punishments under older hudud laws, were formulated within specific historical and social contexts.
Contexts that may no longer apply or be understood the same way.
Precisely. He calls for a reevaluation through Ijtihad to see if these interpretations truly align with the core principles of justice in Islam and with modern legal developments, both nationally and internationally. The goal is to counter the widespread, often erroneous perception that Islam treats women as inherently unequal.
He also questions some cultural practices.
Yeah, he asks whether things like excluding women from mosques or certain cultural or religious activities are genuinely rooted in Islamic teachings, or if they're more about patriarchal customs that have crept in and now need to be challenged through reasoned ijtihad.
Financial matters seem like another massive area. You touched on trade earlier.
Huge and incredibly complex. Khan basically says we're trying to apply first-century Arabian economics to a 21st century globalized financial system. It doesn't work.
The issue of interest, riba, must be central here.
Absolutely central. He poses the tough questions. Is all interest forbidden, haram, or only specific types like exploitative usury? How do Muslims ethically engage with international trade, modern banking systems, insurance, even things like prize bonds where interest or something very much like it is integral?
And what about traditional Islamic finance models?
How do models like mudaraba, profit sharing, or musharaka joint ventures actually function effectively and competitively in today's complex global markets? How do you protect savings from inflation? How do you handle financial dealings with non-Muslims in this intricate system? These are questions classical jurists simply didn't face.
He's really calling for some heavy-duty economic thinking.
He is. He basically says the Muslim world needs thinkers capable of doing for Islamic economics what Adam Smith or Karl Marx did for Western economics, undertaking a total ijtihad to challenge what he calls irrational orthodoxy and develop relevant, principle-based solutions.
That really highlights the scale of what he's proposing. What about the legal system itself, jurisprudence?
Again, he argues the existing fiqh framework, while brilliant for its time, is largely 1,000 years old and doesn't adequately cover modern needs banking law, insurance law, intellectual property, communications technology, corporate law. The list goes on.
He mentioned a difference in criminal law perspective, too.
Yeah, the shift from seeing many crimes as primarily a personal matter between the offender and the victim's family, who might have the right to forgive or demand compensation.
Right. The wali deciding.
To the modern state system, where crime is an offense against society, prosecuted by the state versus Smith, not Smith versus the victim's family.
So how could Ijtihad address that?
Khan suggests exploring the existing Islamic legal concept of fasad fil ard, spreading corruption or disorder in the land. Could certain serious crimes be categorized under this, making the state an injured party? This could allow courts to proceed with punishment for the public good, even if the victim's family offers forgiveness, aligning better with modern public law concepts.
Interesting. And he mentioned maruf.
Yes, the principle of maruf, which means what is generally known, accepted, and considered good or reasonable within a particular society. He notes that Imam Abu Hanifa himself accepted custom, urf, or maruf, as a source of interpretation in certain cases. Khan argues this principle needs to be applied much more actively today in developing modern laws and jurisprudence that are both principled and practical for contemporary societies.
Okay, one last major area he flags, worldly education.
He calls this a life and death question for Muslims. This historical and often still present divide between religious education and secular education.
Where secular knowledge is sometimes seen as less important or even suspect.
Exactly. Sometimes treated as merely worldly or even potentially sinful. Khan argues this has disastrous consequences. It isolates the religiously educated from understanding the modern world and contributing to fields like science, technology, economics, social sciences. And it can give religiously inclined youth a negative attitude towards essential modern knowledge, hindering progress.
So Ijtihad is needed to bridge that gap.
Urgently needed to fundamentally rethink curricula, teaching methods, and the whole philosophy of education, to integrate beneficial knowledge from all fields, seeing it all as potentially valuable within an Islamic worldview.
These are huge, complex areas, and he implies there are many more.
Oh yes, he says these are just examples. The need for this kind of courageous, total ijtihad is widespread.
So, given this ambitious, almost overwhelming call for intellectual renewal across so many fields, how does Khan suggest this could actually happen? Does he offer a practical path forward?
He does suggest a kind of structured process, putting the onus primarily on major international Islamic organizations.
Like the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Conference.
Exactly. He suggests they should take the lead.
How? What would they do?
He outlines a few steps. First, systematically identify and draw up a list of all the key contemporary issues that require fresh ijtihad.
Okay.
Then prepare detailed questionnaires on these topics. Not just simple questions, but really digging into the complexities.
And send these out globally.
Yes, send them to qualified scholars and experts worldwide, crucially, not just religious scholars, ulama, but also specialists in the relevant secular fields, like economics, law, sociology, science.
Get input from all sides.
Right. Then collect all those opinions and circulate them widely among other scholars for review, comment, and critique. Build a body of informed discussion.
And the final step.
Convene major international conferences. Bring together these diverse groups of ulama and experts face-to-face to deliberate, consult, debate respectfully, and try to reach some form of consensus or at least well-reasoned majority and minority opinions on these pressing issues.
So a large-scale, collaborative, intellectual effort.
Exactly. And he suggests other bodies could participate too, like the Rabita Alam Islamic Muslim World League or the Mu'tamar Alam Islamic World Muslim Congress and other respected religious institutions. It needs a coordinated push.
This deep dive into Zafarullah Khan's perspective has certainly given us a lot to think about. His core message is really a powerful plea for, well, for intellectual courage.
Absolutely. For a total ijtihad, a deep, courageous reinterpretation, which he sees as absolutely essential if Islam is to remain relevant and vibrant, and if Muslim communities are going to overcome this stagnation he describes and really thrive in the modern world.
Tackling these incredibly complex new issues, from minority rights and life under non-Muslim rule, all the way to global finance, modern law, education, it's a huge task.
It is. But that link back to the hadith of the judge is so important, isn't it? The idea that the sincere effort, the striving itself is rewarded, even if you make a mistake.
Yeah, that feels like crucial encouragement, a way to maybe overcome that fear of error that Khan identifies as such a major roadblock.
It aims to liberate the intellectual spirit, you could say.
It definitely leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty profound question to mull over. Considering those historical examples, Khan points to the Prophet at Hudaybiyah, Sohaib Rumi, the early jurists disagreeing respectfully and looking at the urgent issues identified today. How can Muslim communities actually cultivate that environment of intellectual renewal Khan is calling for? How do you overcome the inertia?
And perhaps what role could any individual, including you, play in fostering that kind of critical thinking, that courageous engagement needed to apply timeless Islamic principles to the very real challenges of our 21st century?